I could see it in your faces. I could tell it by your body language right away. There is nothing more thrilling to a Roman Catholic congregation than when the gospel reading begins with a long list of unpronounceable biblical names. The gospel reading today from St. Luke's gospel begins as follows. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, when Herod was tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip, tetrarch of the region of Iturea and Trachonitis. Trachonitis? Is that a lung disease? And Lysanias was tetrarch of Abilene, and during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas. And as soon as you heard that, your eyes glazed over. Some of you got your second collection envelopes and you took money out of it. I saw you. For many of us, listening to a long list of hard-to-pronounce names is as fun as those satanic voicemail systems that don't let you press 0 to talk to a real person. You know the ones I mean. For John, press 1 now. And then you have to listen to the entire list. For Jane, press 2 now. For Bob, press 3 now. To keep your head from exploding, press 4 now. So why do we have to listen to this long list of names at the beginning of today's gospel? When the church was putting together the lectionary, why didn't they just skip all that and begin with this? The word of the Lord came to John in the desert. That's the point, isn't it? Well, I think we included that list of biblical names because to the people who first heard St. Luke's gospel, these names meant something. St. Luke records all of these names in a rather solemn way because his first listeners would have heard that list of names and they would have groaned, not out of boredom, but out of disgust. The people named by St. Luke were terrible leaders at a time when ancient Israel was suffering. These names are the names connected to one of the darkest periods in Jewish history. St. Luke begins in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. Well, who is he? Tiberius is a Roman emperor, and it was the Romans who had taken over Israel. And the Romans had stolen the Jewish homeland and destroyed Jewish freedom. Tiberius even threatened to enslave the Jewish people. So when people heard that name Tiberius, they thought of that awful leader, of that awful empire who had conquered us. St. Luke continues, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea. Well, you know Pontius Pilate. Was he most famous for? That. Crucifying Christ. What you may not know is how awful he was to the Jewish people as a whole. How he stole money from the temple in Jerusalem. How he arranged the murders of Jewish leaders. He was a terrible local Roman leader at a terrible time. Herod and Philip, they are brothers, and they are the worst of the worst on this list because they are Jews who are collaborating with the Romans. Herod and Philip got themselves set up as puppet kings, propped up by Roman military force, which means that these Jewish kings can steal taxes from the Jewish neighbors and seize their property. Herod and Philip were sending the wealth of Israel to Rome so that Rome would allow them to keep being in power. They were working with the enemy. They are awful. Tiberius, Pilate, Herod, Philip. If you were to ask Jews and Christians at the end of the first century to name the worst leaders and one of the worst spirits in recent memory, this would be the list of names they would come up with. So when people heard this in St. Luke's Gospel, they would have groaned and they would have said, what a terrible time that was. To get a modern feel of it, imagine if I was about to tell you something that God was up to, and I begin like this. In those days, when Richard Nixon was in charge of honesty, when Bill Clinton was in charge of chastity, when Donald Trump was in charge of hair care products. You get the idea. You would shake your heads and say, what a terrible time. St. Luke's listeners wouldn't have laughed because their suffering was so still clear in their memories. So why does St. Luke give us this list of biblical names? Because it is a shorthand. It's a way of saying in very few words the following truth. In those days, when we had lost our home, and foreign powers were occupying us, and strangers sought to destroy our way of life. In those days, when even our own political leaders were making things worse. In those days, when the suffering was overwhelming, and the fear and the anger were palpable, and hope seemed foolish. It was in those days that the word of the Lord came to John the Baptist saying, "Get out there and do something. Go out there and say something. Tell the people of God to do something." But it's going to require that we cooperate and change our hearts and change our ways. It is St. Luke's way of saying, the Savior is coming. Help is coming. But the arrival of that help is going to require human cooperation. In other words, it is St. Luke's way of saying, in the darkest time, the word of the Lord came. I think sometimes many of us misunderstand prayer. Our faith teaches us that when we experience difficult moments, painful moments, dark moments in our lives, the first thing that we have to do is to pray. Because prayer allows God to be the one who directs our response. If we don't pray when we experience difficulty, then our response is controlled solely by our emotions, or by our fears, or by our hate. If we do not pray, our response will be controlled by which cable network we choose to watch, or what political points we want to score with our latest post on social media. Christ and his gospel have to be the source of our response to darkness. And in order to find that connection and that source, we should remember how God intervened in those dark and hopeless days of Tiberius and Pilate, and Herod and Philip. When it was darkest for those people, the word of the Lord stirred in John the Baptist. And God said, I am going to bring light to the darkness. I am going to bring hope to the hopeless. I am going to bring help to the helpless. But that means that everybody who hears the word of the Lord must be willing to do something with it. Ignoring God is a dangerous self-deception. It is equally dangerous to tell yourself that you have done your part because you have prayed a Hail Mary. We live in a world suffering from the impacts of war, economic hardships, social injustice, and countless afflictions of mind, body, and soul. We are very blessed to live here in the United States, but many of us feel burdened with a sense of concern, or anger, or fear, or frustration. And we are asking ourselves, how do we solve these problems? How do we address these concerns? How do we even create a better world for our children and our grandchildren? Well, John the Baptist in today's gospel was listening for the word of the Lord. And he heard it in those days of Tiberius and Pilate and Herod and Philip, those darkest days. And when he heard it, he knew he had to act. So he went into the desert and he started baptizing, calling people to change. Friends, prayer enables us to listen to the word of the Lord, just like John did. But prayer itself is not the solution. It is the source of the solution. Prayer is the communication by which Christ will tell us what role he wants each one of us to play to be part of the solution. It is a very good Christian wisdom to understand this. If you are going to pray about anything at all, if you are going to pray about something, then you better be ready to hear the word of the Lord when Christ says to you, I am going to fix that thing that you are praying about, and here's how you are going to help me. In those days, in those dark days of Tiberius and Pilate and Herod and Philip, the word of the Lord came to somebody who was listening. In these days of violent people, of angry people, of hopeless people, of frustrated people, the word of the Lord comes to those who are willing to listen. After all, Jesus Christ is the Word made flesh, and he knows what we need. If you listen, you will hear. But my caution to you this morning is this: do not pray. Do not pray unless you are willing to act. In these days, in this time, this Advent.